And again, this is the Parent Backpack Series, Data and You, understanding how data is used to determine your child's progress. And we always want to acknowledge our County Board of Education and Dr. Monica Golson, who is our Chief Executive Officer. As I said when I made introductions, we are from the Family Support Center, and the Family Support Center is in the Department of Special Education. Our mission is to help families going through the IEP process to have information on specific disabilities, help them navigate the IEP process, provide resources both in school and community. We also have on this PowerPoint, and we'll send you a copy of the PowerPoint after the presentation. We have workshops and our calendar of all of our things coming up. Just so you know, we do have a parent empowerment conference coming up starting in March, and that runs through the beginning of June, that will have multiple sessions of both PGCPS and outside providers providing resources and trainings. So we hope to see you all there for that. We do also have consultations for our IEP process, and we also attend IEP meetings with parents. On this slide, when you get the slides, you'll see a link to our YouTube channel, which houses all of the recordings that exist for our previous presentations. We also have a link to our Twitter feed here, which is a great way to keep up with what's going on in our Family Support Center and the sessions that we have upcoming. And we also have a link to our Family Support Center webpage, which includes a short introductory video of what our Family Support Center does, and all kinds of printed resources and web link resources that you can access. So, as I said, this is part 4 in our backpack series, and tonight we're going to discuss, how do I know if my child is making progress? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Miss Young for our welcome and check-in.
Good evening, everyone. Buenos tardes. I hope everyone has had a good day. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know you have a lot of choices on your Thursday evening, and so we're going to try to make this as interesting and engaging and informative as possible. But before we begin, please, can you take a moment and complete our check-in poll?
And you should see it on your screen now. It's just launched.
We just want to get to know a little bit about who's in the room, and this is going to help us tailor our information to those of you who are in the room with us tonight. Thank you so much. I see responses coming in. We just want to know, what's your child's age, grade, and does your child have a disability? We know that there could be teachers or even community members joining us who may or may not have children with a disability, but still, this topic, I think, could be informative across the board.
So we're going to give it about 15 more seconds. It looks like the majority of you have answered.
Marcy, it looks like we have a age and grade span tonight.
I know, I was looking at that. Let me end the poll and it'll show us our results. So looking at it, it looks like we have a range from age 6 all the way up through perhaps 21. We've got a good section of grade levels. And it looks like we have, most of our folks have students with disabilities, but this presentation really applies to all students.
And we thank you for that, for completing our poll. I'm going to try to keep that in the back of my mind, and Marcy's going to try to keep it in the back of her mind as we progress forward. The goals for tonight are to understand how data can be used within the IEP process, to review the types of data that are used, and to understand and determine how to understand and determine the best, how data can be best used to determine if your child is making progress. So let's begin with first coming to a common agreement on how we define data, because it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So, but in general, data is something that you can see, you can count, you can describe. It's not personal, it's observable, it provides a snapshot in time, and can be formal or informal, qualitative or quantitative. But in general, it can be presented in different ways: charts, graphs, numerical, narrative, and we're going to dive deeper into all the ways that we might see data presented. Here at the school system, and particularly in special education, we're always tracking data, right? Why would you wouldn't send your child to school and not want to know how they're doing and if they're progressing? So tracking data is really important for us in our system. And we do that so that will inform the development and implementation of an IEP or IEP amendment. Some folks, some students may need to develop or update a functional behavioral assessment or behavior intervention plan. And in general, we want to identify areas of progress as well as needs and growth. There are multiple types of data. And here are some of the categories of data. There's student data for individual, there's teacher data, there's even system-wide data, but data is useful in helping us to assess and monitor progress against benchmarks that are established. So of course, the school district as a whole or the state as a whole has benchmarks for students to achieve. And we need data to make sure at the classroom level that students are progressing at the individual level. Teachers can use data to determine the effectiveness of their teaching methods or to gain some valuable information about the effect of new teaching methods even on students. And we need to examine if there's evidence of improvement over time or students learning more. Data is a powerful motivator for teachers, and it validates that what changes we're making, are they helpful and are they useful? So like I said, some examples of system-wide data are state assessments, grade reports or report cards, student on special education data. We have a whole series of data, right? We have intervention data and IEP data and IEP and BIP reports. We have reevaluations, psychological assessments, cognitive assessments, work samples, disciplinary reports, communication logs. Wow, there's a lot. We're going to focus tonight mostly on special education data, and school and data to schools specifically. When we collect data, the results can be, the results represent a snapshot in time, like I said before, but that's why it's important for us to also look at trend data. Trend data provides us with a view of progress over time. It's really important for us to collect trend data because suppose there's special circumstances for that child. Maybe we don't want just to make decisions based upon how a student is feeling today and maybe they'll be feeling differently tomorrow. We want to look at some trends over time. And in our system, especially with special education, one form of data that you should definitely expect to get is IEP progress for those of you with children with an IEP. So you should be getting IEP progress reports quarterly, or which is the law requires you to get a report at least as often as non-disabled peers receive progress, also known as report cards, right? So we get report cards quarterly. We should be getting IEP progress reports quarterly. And if you didn't receive it, that's an indicator to reach out to your IEP team and ask, hey, what happened to my IEP progress report? You might also be getting intervention data, standardized assessments, review of present levels on the IEP. All of these are taken together to create a profile, and it's a profile of trends all the time, so we can know, is a student making progress? And we're going to talk about on the next slide, present levels of performance. So this page looks probably familiar to you, except for all of our little boxes and edits that we have on it. This is section 2 of the IEP that is labeled present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And here is actually where you would see that trend data that I was talking about. It feeds into this IEP right here. So in our example, you would see the math problem solving, and it shows you the sources of data. And of course, on a real IEP, you would see multiple sources of data for multiple categories. You would see some reading data, some math data. You might see some cognitive assessments. What we want you to know is that trend data on this level, on this section of the IEP, should include 2 years of data unless it's a brand new IEP. And also to the right, you'll see some more information about the boxes that tells you year 1 or year 2, and then the impact. What is the area of impact that this data is having academically for that student? As a reminder, whatever area of impact is identified here, you should find a corresponding goal and objective later on the IEP. And Marcy's going to fill in if I leave out anything. As a matter of fact, Marcy's going to take over now.
All right. So Yvette gave you a good, really detailed global overview of what data is and what data are. So we want you to know that data aren't just numbers. She talked in the example of present level of performance that part of the requirement for present levels of performance with students with IEPs is that we have, unless it's a new IEP, trend across years. And so when we look at things like this, we want to see qualitative and descriptive data. And that data may come in the form of a narrative. It may come in the form of explaining where the student is, not just chronologically, not just grade level wise, but the skills and what students know and are able to do. And so when you look at those trends across years, you want to look at the fact that the data being presented shouldn't be any more than 1 year old. Like Yvette said, it should contain 2 or more sources of data for each area. It also can be examined through the lenses of goals and objectives. One of the things when we review IEPs that we look at really closely is whether or not the goals and objectives are changing over time. So when you get a draft of a new IEP prior to the IEP meeting, which you should receive 5 business days prior to the meeting, one of the things you want to do is compare. So for example, if you have a student who's in 3rd grade and their 2nd grade skill was to identify addition facts with 100% accuracy, and you look at the new IEP and the goal is exactly the same, then that's data that's telling you that even if last year they said they were making sufficient progress, there might be some concerns and considerations that you need to look at about that student making progress. And so you really want to look closely at those goals and objectives and how they're written. Knowing how those change or don't over the years can help you tell if your student's making progress. And if the goals and objectives don't change, are they then really making progress? How is the team adjusting Are the services different? Are the supports and aids different? Are the accommodations different? Those are all things that you can ask when you compare those two IEPs. And you want to compare instructional grade level performances from year to year. Is there more than an incremental change? You want to compare statewide and curriculum-based assessments. We have a lot of assessments in our district. Some schools still give MAP, which is a reading test. Kindergarten gives DIBELS, which is a phonics and reading test. A lot of students get iReady reports. All of these tests come with what we call individual student reports, and they're either sent electronically or they're sent in the mail or in your student's backpack. All of those things report progress. And in addition to the quantitative, which is the numbers, they give descriptions of what your student should know and be able to do at that age or grade level. One of the important things about those is most of those assessments, if they're standardized, give you what it means. So it'll tell you, for example, a MAP-R score will tell you 425. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been doing MAP scores for a very long time, and I could not tell you what grade level or age level MAP-R scores are. They change them based on national norms and things like that. So each individual student report that you get should have some definition and some context of what is given if you give a score. And suppose your child has a goal of requesting help in the classroom. One of the things you want to look at progress-wise is, can he do this in a real-world situation? Can you look at those goals and objectives and see whether or not he can use the skills that are being taught in school? And one of the things I want to add on is that data, like Yvette said, are also used by teachers to inform their teaching practice. One of the standardized assessments we give in our school district are benchmarks, and they're curriculum-based, and they do come with individual student response reports. But not only do they give you data so that you can tell how your student is doing based upon the curriculum that's been taught, they give your teachers data. And so data is used to inform their teaching practices. And so they give the teacher the opportunity to actually go in to analyze what accommodations have been used, how many answers the student actually gave versus getting wrong answers. They allow the teachers, and sometimes in their collaborative planning, to figure out what was going through the student's head. So for example, if you have 4 times 4 and one of the wrong answers is 16, you know that the student multiplied instead of added to get the correct answer of 8. And that's something that you can do on your child's classwork and homework that comes home as well. It's important to look what your child got wrong and what that might mean as far as how they're learning, how they're thinking, all of those kind of things. So we're going to move into, before we take data either at the classroom level or at the home level, we need to have a common understanding of what we're looking at. And that's called an operational definition. And these next several slides, we're going to take at through the lens of students who have behavioral challenges, or through the lens of looking at taking data on behavior. This can apply to students with learning disabilities, students with intellectual disabilities. It can all apply to all kinds of data. We wanted to take kind of this straight and narrow path as a concrete example for you. So an operational definition describes the expected behavior so that it is observable and measurable. You heard Yvette talk earlier about data is not personal. It's not subjective. It's not an opinion. It's something that is observable and measurable. And it's written so that you can hand that definition off to anyone else, and anyone else would easily be able to identify whether or not that behavior is occurring. So we're going to look at a couple examples. Aggression. So in this definition, hitting is defined as any occurrence of making contact with any part of another person's body with an open or closed hand from a distance of 6 inches or more. That's very specific, right? If you were to watch a video and look to count how many times, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how many times hitting is defined as any occurrence of making contact with another person's body, that would discern it from a non-example of throwing something and hitting attempts but not making contact, hitting and making contact with an object, hitting and making contact clothing, but not the person's body. We always want to include non-examples so that we know what actions are excluded. So we want to take a minute and pause and hear from you. One of the things in the Family Support Center that we hear consistently is that my child is not successful. My child's not making progress. These are the things I hear from the school. I'm not sure I understand what's going on at school. My child, A, B, and C. So we want to hear from you, and we're going to use something that will put our words into a word cloud so that we can kind of see what people are hearing from their schools. So on your device, you can either scan the QR code or go to the website, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. So give me just 1 second. And that will allow you to access our Mentimeter, which is going to provide us with a word cloud. So we want to know, what words and phrases do you hear from the school team when there are challenges at school? If you have trouble logging on, please let me know and we'll see what we can do.
And that could be if you happen to be one who receives phone calls, messages, emails. What are some common words or phrases that you hear when they call? Or when they contact you? It's a quiet crew, Marcy.
I know.
Does anybody receive contacts from the school? Or is it just the few or the many who call the Family Support Center? We hear parents when they call us and they tell us the school is calling me, the school is messaging me. Here we go. Is frustrated, cried.
Not focusing, easily distracted, not participating, playing.
Any other common phrases or comments you hear?
Anyone want to come off mute or put it in the chat if you can't access the Mentimeter? Okay, so we were going to do a breakout activity, but I think we have a small enough group, Yvette, that we can do it probably in one activity. I'm going to put the link to a document in our chat so that everyone can access. We'll go back to our presentation. So I want to take the one, Yvette, I think that had frustration, and think about what that would look like in a classroom setting. Can anyone help us?
Frustration.
Can you put it in the chat? What does that look like when you look at a student who's frustrated, or the school calls and says your student is frustrated? What does that look like? So let's think about it. When I think of a student that's frustrated, I think of a student who is crying or exhibiting anger, or what is something observable that would show frustration? They're stomping their feet. Someone said it may be displayed as crying. So you want to think about it through the lens of what it looks like physically that you can observe or hear or see, and making sure that your definition is clear and measurable. Can you count it? Can anyone else look at that data and count what you see? So we talked about looking like crying. Anything else? Yvette, how else would someone show frustration?
What I was thinking about facial expressions, right? A frowned face or squinted eyes.
Okay.
Did you want to say something, Ms. Sanchez?
Sí, buenas noches. Mi niño es Wilfredo Fermán y cuando a mí me hablan de la escuela como, oh, Wilfredo está llorando, yo lo que le digo, oh, sé por qué llora cuando él no quiere hacer la tarea que lo pone la maestra. Entonces yo le digo, déjalo, él ya se le va a pasar, dígale, no pasa nada, todo está bien, y ya mi niño se tranquiliza. Y esas son las palabras que digo, papá, no pasa nada, ¿ok? Todo está bien, relájese y juegue, ya él ya se le pasa. Es lo que yo hago con mi niño.
She's basically saying, and it would be better if one of our interpreters can come out of the interpretation room to translate better for us. But she was basically saying that her sometimes her child is crying, doesn't want to do the homework, you know, frustrated. I think she was saying at home things are okay, but maybe Miss Edith or Miss Ileana can help us.
Let's see.
And muchas gracias, señora Marilyn, for your information, for la información, for participando.
Participar, señora. Estamos viendo la manera de cómo compartir esta información que usted nos acaba de dar.
And Miss Ileana, I've brought you out of the interpretation.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So Mom was saying basically that when she received a phone call, they say, your child is been crying. And she goes, yes, I know he's crying because he doesn't want to do the homework. So if you go and tell him, it's okay, nothing happened, it's okay, he will calm down. That's what the mom replied to the person who is on the other side of the line. So mom basically received the phone call, and the complaint is that your child has been crying and crying. And mom goes, yes, I know why he's crying, because he doesn't want to do the homework. But if you tell him, it's okay, nothing happened, he will calm down and he will do the homework. That's what she replies.
And thank you so muchas gracias. Thank you so much for that definition, because what Marcy is sharing is crying, right? Tears streaming down his face. Right now we want to focus on, some people might just say, oh, he's having a tantrum. But if he's having a tantrum, I don't know what that means. It might mean one thing to Marcy, one thing to Senora Madeline, another thing to me. So we want to know if we look at it and see it, what does that look like? How many times is he crying? What time of day is he crying? But our operational definition so far is crying with tears. Maybe it's at a volume, a high altitude volume.
Maybe it's preventing him from working.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say,
oh, his head could be bowed, or his head could be like not looking at the paper.
So, and when you're looking at that, you might want to look at if he's crying, but he's still completing his work, you wouldn't count that, because the behavior that you're looking to change is the crying preventing him from working. And so you might want to look at something like that.
So that would be the non-example, right, Marcy?
Right.
Does anyone have questions or another example that we can use for creating an operational definition? We can't emphasize to you how important this is. If the teacher is just calling mom saying, little sweetie is crying, we don't know what that means. And so therefore we don't know what to do with that.
Okay, well then let's talk about what we start with. So the operational definition is really important of that behavior. And that's our starting point. We want to know what behavior we're looking at. The next thing you want to do, if you're at home, or the next thing that the teacher should be doing, is taking data of what that behavior looks like before you try to alter it, before you try to change it. And we call that baseline data. So this is data that are collected before any intervention is introduced. And an intervention is something that's introduced to your child in order to change or alter the behavior. And remember, behavior is anything that's observable and measurable that is with the student interacting with his environment.
Pardon me, Marcy, we don't see the slides.
Oh, well, there we go. Thank you for letting me know. All right. So again, baseline data is data that are collected before any intervention is introduced. And it's really important because, as we talked about on the slides prior to this, you want to look at trends and you want to look at where the data is going. So if you don't have where you started, you can't go where you end, and you can't see if the intervention was effective. So the first type of data we look at is...
Pardon me, Marcy, for one second. A question came in, which I think is good for the whole group. What behavior is crying but working at school? Crying and not doing the work at home. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Terry, about not for some time. So I might be sobbing softly at my desk, but still doing my work. Does that capture crying but still working?
And part of that, I think, Yvette, is we want to think in terms of what students are doing that affects their academics. And so if it's a behavior that's occurring, but it's not affecting their academics or their functioning, then that might not be something that we focus on, like the crying without it stopping doing the work. Does that make sense?
If we are not answering, we are a nice small group. Please feel free to unmute. So a further message is taking longer to start work at home after crying than it takes them for starting work at school. That is awesome. I'm so glad you shared that, because that's data collection that we're going to talk more about, and very important data, because you know what's really good about this chat question, taking longer. We don't know what taking longer means, and we don't know what taking shorter means. So that's the whole reason for the operational definition. We want, and the collecting the baseline data. We want to know, what's the starting point? Are they crying for 5 minutes? That's really different if they're crying for 15 minutes. And we'll talk about what we do with that data after we collect it.
So one of the pieces of data collection that we talk about are different types of data collection. And this can go on at the school level, it can go on at home. It depends on what you're counting and how the behaviors are occurring. That helps you decide which method that's used to collect the data. And so the first type is frequency, and that counts the number of times a behavior occurs. Every occurrence of a behavior or skill is documented within a period of time. We use this for behaviors that are easily observed and counted. Some examples are the number of times the child hits, or kicks, or slams the door. So anything that you can easily just look at that operational definition and then count the number of times that behavior happens. And that makes it into quantitative or numerical data that you can then, you'll see the graph at the bottom here, you can then graph or put in a spreadsheet or put in a picture and see how that data goes over time, from baseline to when you start the intervention to after the intervention has occurred. A different type of data collection is duration. And this might be helpful for the crying that we talked about in our operational definition. Duration documents how long a behavior lasts. So you want to use this data collection method for low or moderate rate behaviors. And all that means is that it's not something that occurs that you can see an easy beginning and end to, and you can count it just once in that split second. This is something that may occur over a period of time, and you want to know how long it's occurring so that you can see if, when you do your intervention, those periods shorten themselves. And if it has a very clear beginning and end, like the student starts crying and then they end crying. And examples of this are how long a tantrum lasts, how long a child spends reading a book or doing their homework. And the homework one is really important. That said, we're going to talk a little bit later about what to do with this data. But just thinking about homework and how long it takes is a really nice data point to tell your teacher at the school, to tell them if your student is either struggling with the homework or how long it's taking at night. An additional type of data collection is latency. And this is the amount of time that lapses between an antecedent and when the child begins to perform a specified behavior. And we'll talk in a couple slides about what an antecedent is. But you want to know, when the teacher says, okay, get your book out, how long it takes for the student to actually get the book out. Sometimes we hear from parents who call and say, they're telling me my child never gets to work. They're telling me my child doesn't follow directions. So one of the data collection methods that you can use is measuring the amount of time between the time the teacher gives the directive and the time the student follows the direction. How long does it take to sit down? How long does it take to stop? How long does it take to pick it up after you've made that request? Another type of data collection is time sampling, and this is a little more complex. And there are varieties of methods for recording behavior during interval or specific moment in time. You want to see, for whole interval, how long the behavior occurs, the entire interval, which means the entire time you're looking at them. Partial is when a behavior occurs or does not occur during a specified time period. It could be any instance within that time period, or it could be at the exact moment that you're taking data. And finally, we want to talk about permanent products. So a permanent product is something that is created that you can look at afterwards and measuring the effects of that behavior. And those are the real or concrete objects or outcomes that result from that behavior. So going back to our operational definition, if your student is frustrated and crying, and part of that frustration looks like, and it's in your operational definition, he or she ripping up or crumpling assignments. One of the things you might count, in addition to how long they cry or how long it takes them to start to get to work, is how many assignments are ripped or crumpled up, or the number of homework assignments that get completed. How many pencils did the student throw? Or sometimes a teacher could provide a picture of destruction in a classroom after an outburst. So all of these that we've just gone through in these last 5 slides are ways of taking data that paint a picture. Each is appropriate for a specific type of behavior or a specific type of time period or data collection. But they really don't mean anything unless it's trustworthy. You have to be able to trust the data that's coming out of your observation. So when we look at, regardless of the type of data that's collected, if you're questioning it, it's important to state what you're questioning. And so that really takes the form of 3 different ways. And the validity involves the extent to which the data represents the phenomenon being observed. So for example, the alarm clock rings at 7 each morning, but it's really set for 6:30. So that's really not valid. It's not ringing at the desired time. On the other hand, reliability means that each person or each time it's observed, it is the same time. So for example, if I'm watching a student and I'm counting hits, and Yvette's watching a student and she counts hits, we're getting basically the same data in the same time period. The last piece is accuracy. So the example I would use for accuracy, you want to make sure that your data is actually representing what happened. And so the example I would use is this clock example where it's set for 6:30, but it rings at 7 each morning. But the data that they show you from school says that it actually is ringing at 6:30. That's not accurate data. Or the teacher has observed and the student hits according to the operational definition and makes contact 6 times within a 5-minute period. But the data that they show you is 13 times because they're not actually using that operational definition. So that's where you really want to make sure your data is valid, it's reliable, and it's accurate. Now we've talked about the types of data collection. I'm going to turn it over to Yvette, who is briefly going to go through some data collection definitions so that you can better understand why we would take data in these situations.
We have covered a lot of information. I thought, we could take a breath and a pause. Does anybody have any questions about what we've been covering so far? Either more questions about operational definitions or questions about what Marcy was just covering regarding methods of data collection, why about validity, reliability. And you can feel free to put the information in the chat and we'll make sure to address them as we go along. I also want to mention our other partner, Dr. Beth Jete, has joined us this evening, who is a board certified behavior analyst, and who will make sure if I don't get this right, she will help me make sure that we get it right. One of the things, because we do have folks who are joining us tonight who don't necessarily have a child with an IEP, or maybe are just interested in a topic in general, what we're covering now about data collection is applicable in many, many different circumstances. And I also want to mention, we tend to talk about behavior and data from a corrective standpoint, what's wrong and how can we figure out what's wrong. But this information can also be used to figure out what's right and what's going right and how we can make things go even better. Okay, we have a question. Why are we covering all this measurement theory? Is it to understand IEP reports, or are you asking parents to collect meaningful data? That is an excellent question. We actually want to give, we're painting, and you reminded me of a comment I wanted to make. We're painting a broad brush for you so you can do a little perspective taking and understand when teachers and educators present data and information to you, how did they get there? So that you would be able to advocate for your students more effectively and be able to communicate what information, what other information you might need that might have been left out, or clarify any information that's provided to you that now after this presentation, you might say to yourself, it might trigger some more questions and help you to help the team clarify what do we need the student to do, or how can we help the student more effectively. Marcy, you have any thoughts on this?
I think it goes for both sides, right? The more that you understand how the school system and how the teachers are taking data, like Yvette said, the better you can ask informed questions. But it might also be something that, should you choose to investigate these methods a little more, you may be able to mimic that data collection at home to see if your student can generalize it into the home environment, or to provide more meaningful data to the school when you have your parental input at the IEP table.
And also, yes, it may help you better understand what's the data that's in the IEP itself, that's often written in some technical lease, or in the other reports that you might see, whether they be psychological reports or benchmark reports or assessment reports. This is, again, a broad brush so that you would be it would be more meaningful and make better sense to you. And at the risk of going a little bit further with this, I want to cover some data collection that we call ABC data collection. A standing for antecedent, B standing for behavior, C standing for consequences. And if your child does display or does exhibit behaviors at school, and again, remember what I said, this could be used positively or correctively. We want to understand not just that, oh, Johnny is doing these things that are disruptive, but why? And when we collect ABC data, this helps us to understand patterns and trends. And that's what this whole data presentation is all about, to help us better understand patterns and trends. So we want to know what's happening before the behavior begins. That's the antecedent or the trigger. And are there some current circumstances that repeat themselves prior to a similar kind of behavior? Then what's the behavior? We already talked about what does that behavior look like? How can I know whether I or somebody else is looking at that behavior, that it looks the same? And then what's the consequence? What happens immediately after that behavior occurs? So we want to know the trigger, we want to know what the behavior is, and we want to know what happens immediately after, so that we can identify what's the potential function of that behavior. It's only if we understand this pattern that we could intervene effectively. So by way of an example here, now we have a question in Spanish. I have a question. Specializing. If one of our interpreters can help me a little bit. I'm not sure I totally understand the full context of the question. So let me just go on for the sake of it. So here we have a chart displaying some ABC, antecedent behavior and consequence, ABC data collection. And as you can see in our chart, it tells us some dates, times, what happened before the behavior that occurred, what happened immediately after the behavior, which is the consequence, and a possible function of that behavior.
Yvette, I'm going to return to the question one of the interpreters just messaged. The question is, at what age can they receive an IEP? And this information is excellent. So I think let's wait until we get done with the slides, and then we can talk about ages for IEPs. The short answer is special education covers from birth to 21, but we can talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation.
So this is just an example of, after we collected data, we might want to quantify it and categorize it in a chart format so that we can look for trends. That's the key. We're looking for trends, commonalities that can help us understand what might be the function of that behavior. This is very important if a child is displaying challenging behaviors and there becomes a need for what we call a functional behavior assessment or a behavior intervention plan. So the functional behavior assessment, it is this process of first identifying what is the behavior we're looking at. We identify what is the behavior we're looking at by counting it, coming to some common understandings of what that behavior is, looking at the context of when it occurs, making sure that it's something that we can observe, that we can look at the specific antecedents, the context of the routine. We want to get a picture of what's happening through this as part of this functional behavior assessment. And so one section of the functional behavioral assessment looks like this. And here's where we'd like you to see how it can all come together, everything that we're talking about tonight. And you do not have to have an IEP for your child to have a functional behavior assessment. That's another thing we want to mention, that sometimes some children may just need a functional behavior assessment, a behavior intervention plan to help them with some challenging behaviors, but not need a whole full IEP or individual education plan. But if they did have a functional behavior assessment, here you would find the operational definition of the problem behavior. You'd find the current rate, whether it's over time, quantity, numerically, that would be listed there. You would see some frequency data, interval data, all those methods that Marcy talked about earlier, that would be shown in this section of the functional behavior assessment. And so we're collecting data on this document that's going to help inform a behavior intervention plan. And this is some of the sections of the behavior intervention plan looks like. This would normally be filled in, but this is just a little snapshot of that document. And as you can see, the common theme here what is the behavior? What is the operational definition of that behavior? Now we're going to pick a target behavior. There could be 5 behaviors, but we can't work on everything all at once. So we're going to target a couple of behaviors. We're going to come up with an operational definition. We're going to have a method of data collection and implementation that's going to all inform our plan. So Marcy mentioned earlier, we don't just collect data at school because there's a connection between home, school, and community because your child doesn't just function at school. We want a better picture and a better snapshot of your child in order to be able to make sure your child is learning effectively. So how you collect data for your child at home is important also. So let me ask you a question. Based on the information that we've provided thus far, can you please either put in the chat or unmute and share with us what types of behavior do you currently have on your child at home? Does anybody, can you now think about, you know, I have some data that I can think of on my child at home. What types of data do you have at home? Do you have reports? What data do you have? This could be academic data or other kinds of data.
I see Miss Wilson put in the chat tantrums. Miss Ben put medical records. These are great answers.
Okay, and what's great about it is if we pair these pieces of data down, we could dive deeper into it to say, what do those tantrums look like? How often do they occur? What happens before those tantrums? Grades, somebody said grades. And what we also like to say, grades alone don't tell the whole story. Marcy talked a lot about we need multiple sources of data. So if we take a child has tantrums in reading, and they have low grades in reading, and they have a medical report that says they have, I'm making this up, y'all. They have a medical report that says that they have gastrointestinal problems. We might want to look at the time that, what's the time that reading occurs? Does it occur right after lunch? And maybe that food is contributing to the gastrointestinal problems, and then they have low grades. I'm hoping that this is going to make sense to you why we need to collect data, because what I do if it's a medical problem to intervene is going to be very different for what I do if I think that the problem is related to difficulty of work. So I'm wondering also, what other types of information would you want to have about the data that you have? What other types of questions, now that we've covered some of this, would you have to get a better picture about your child? Can anybody share what else they might like to have? And then I'm going to talk more about data at home. What else would you want to know? While you're thinking about that, other types of information, data that you would share, that you can share with your team at IEP meetings, is time spent doing homework. Marcy talked about that. Are they spending an hour laboring over a particular subject, 3 hours trying to get it all done? What's that look like? Do they need prompts or reminders to do chores? Do they, I got to tell them every time to do the same chore, put your dishes in the sink, put your dishes in the sink, put your dishes in every day? Or is it, I only have to give them a reminder one time at home, and the teacher is saying they need constant reminders to do a task. Other types of data are what do transitions look like at home between activities? When we're getting ready to leave and go out to an activity, does your child need reminders? Does your child need extra time? What does that look like? Or does your child do well at some activities, at sports, but not so well at other activities like going to the grocery store? And what do those interactions with various friends, families, and relatives in the community look like? So I do see some responses back to my prior question of what other information would you want to know? One person would like to know what organizational challenges either that child has, or what does that look like? They have information possibly at home about organization challenges, about leaving homework, personal items, coats, forgetting stuff, leaving stuff. Those are very important pieces of data that you have at home that's unique as a parent that you can use to share with the team to help us help your child. Other home and community data considerations would include, do you understand what you're collecting data on or for? So hopefully now we're getting a better idea of why are we collecting data? What are we collecting this data for? Have you ever used any training or coaching for data collection? Some people, some students may be getting therapy services or ABA therapy services, and you might be receiving some coaching on data collection from another source. Do you have time to collect data at home? This can be a little bit time consuming, but I've been told by coaches and teachers that if we collect the data on the front end, it's going to make our life so much easier on the back end, because we're not guessing at what we're doing. How will we collect data? Somebody mentioned using a timer or a clicker or counting. How are we collecting data? And then how will you communicate the data that you've collected at home with your school team?
Sorry, I had trouble getting off mute. So in light of all those considerations, we want to think about what we're going to collect data at home on. So you can collect videos of your student work, something that's concrete that your teacher can see, pictures of student work samples. Those are snapshots in time that can be scanned or taken into the classroom for sharing the data. And we're going to talk in just a minute about how you can share that data. You can work with the teacher in collaboration and make some checklists so that you can analyze how the student is working and what accommodations are successful at home. So we have data, now what? So this kind of drills down to the question of why are we doing this whole presentation? So we want to talk about some tips and tricks to help you communicate that data and what we can do with that data to help your student. So one of the biggest important things is getting to know the staff at your child's school, attending orientations, open houses, understanding the different roles that teachers have. Who's the general educator? Who's the special educator that's providing this data? Who are the support staff? Obtaining contact information for that relevant school staff so you know how to reach them. And one of the things that I think is really important that becomes an advocacy piece as your kids grow older is giving your child a voice in that data sharing process. So ask your child to describe his or her own strengths, her challenges, their interests, and sharing this information with teachers when you meet them. And that information helps teachers individualize these IEPs to help your children achieve success. Ask your child, ask to see samples of his or her classwork. I spoke with a parent just recently who got a report card, but didn't know where those grades were coming from because there wasn't necessarily that communication system that had been developed. And so asking your child if they bring home the grades, what they stand for, looking over the work with the child. And so you can have those specific questions, which then become data as well, on how to build on areas of strength. Schools use a lot of online portals, and learning how to use those online portals, whether it be SchoolMax or Canvas or Google Classroom, in the places and grades. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to the family portal for SchoolMax if you don't already have access to that. And that's one way that you can get access to your students' grades. It will allow you to put a personal email in, and that way you can access their grades. But you want to ask about any special features of your school's parent portal that can provide you with detailed data about progress. One thing to ask is if you can see information on individual quizzes, homework, test scores, so that you don't just receive the grade at the end of the quarter or at a progress report time. We talked a little bit on this last slide about involving your child, but we want to, what else can you do with your child? So you want to involve your children in the talk. So let's talk. Ask for explanations of any unfamiliar terms. Ask your teacher to show you samples of the child's work to get a full understanding of the performance. Share your own information about your child with the teacher. Let your child share with the teacher. Let them talk about what activities your child's involved in after school. Let them talk about how they're feeling in the classroom. Take your child with you if the school allows it to any parent-teacher conferences. At age 14, children are to be included in the IEP process, in the IEP meetings, as they start that transition process. And then ask your children what they want the teacher to know. Ask them to help you share information about the child with your teacher, and ask your teacher to share that information with the child as well, so that data is really a two-way street. And you want them to play an active role in those discussions because it helps foster that independence and that sense of ownership over their learning and enhancing their motivation to succeed.
Marcy, before we go to the next slide, I want to give us an opportunity to ask any other questions. Again, this is a great time to open up our discussion, because I want to make sure we cover the part about this topic, how I can make sure my child is making progress. And we talked a lot about data, but to connect the dots, the idea is, one, we should have multiple sources of data before we draw any conclusions about what's going on with a child. Two, we should be looking for trends of what's going well, what's not going well, and not only what's going well, but how do we describe it? How do we quantify it? How do we define it so that we all have a common understanding? And then three, what are the different environments that we're making these observations in? Do the observations at school also line up with the observations at home and in the community? We get calls from parents who say, well, I don't see my child displaying the behaviors at home that they complain about at school. Well, that's where you ask the school, where's the data? What's the data? How are you capturing this information so that we can have a better understanding? What's different? What's different at school? what's going on there that's not going on at home, or vice versa. Maybe they're performing fine at school, but they're having struggles at home. And maybe that's because we need to look at the structure. Let's take some data on, well, what's the structure? What's the circumstance? What's the routine at school? And how can we replicate it at home? If we are working together with home and the school team together, that child is going to make better progress. And if you see the data is not improving, you have a right to share that data back with the school and say, hey, I've noticed that the reading scores are trending down, or that the behavior incidents are increasing. Can we collect some data to determine why and how we might intervene?